Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to cover the early high and the late Middle Ages. So this is going to take place over the course of about 4 videos. Each of them will range in about 10 to 15 minutes in length. This first one is generally an overview of the Middle Ages. Next time, we will cover the Lutheran and the German Reformation. And I will say that the theology department has put together a lot of excellent lectures and resources over the Reformation. So I'm probably going to step out of creating lecture videos for a season, and you will have content created by the rest of the department that will help guide you through the Reformation period. And then I will likely step back in when we talk about evangelicalism because that's an area of my expertise, and I'll continue to create content for you about that. All right, so for class next time, be sure to read Platcher's selection on Lutheranism and then Bouchard chapter 2. Just to give you an overall picture of what we are talking about when we talk about the Middle Ages is this span of a millennia that goes from 500 to 1500 roughly. That's when most people look at the Middle Ages. The idea of the Middle Ages actually comes from a Renaissance thinker who was a leader in Florence. His name is Leonardo Bruni, and he innovated the idea of the medium aevum. If you recall, the Renaissance reached back into classical history to the Greco-Roman period. And he coined the Middle Age as this gap period of darkness that existed between the light of the classical era and the new birth that was occurring in the Renaissance. So this idea, the concept of the Middle Ages, has typically been pejorative throughout history. But we're going to find out that that's not really the case today, that there was a lot of great things that came out of the Middle Ages, and there are a lot of concepts that were really important for the rest of history. All right, so let's talk about some of the big things that came out of the middle period in church history. Now, just remember that this is a period of Christendom. Christianity is the main worldview of Europe and the Mediterranean region. The only worldview that is contending against it at this time is the rise of Islam, which begins in the 8th century. So there are 4 main innovations within the Christian church that developed throughout the medieval period. The first was the increased emphasis on monasticism. We've talked a little bit about monasticism. There are 4 main groups of the monastics. There was the Eremitic group, which we talked about the life of St. Anthony in the 4th century. Then there was the Cenobitic group, which is best represented by the 5th century Benedictine monks, which came out of Benedict of Nursia's system of creating a communal environment built on prayer and work and companionship in an orderly system. Then there were the mendicant monks. The mendicants developed from Saint Dominic in the 13th century, and the mendicants were not a community like the Benedictine or the Cenobitic monks, but they were transient monks. They would travel, and they were known for being traveling preachers throughout all of Europe. And they lived on a vow of poverty, and they asked for people to provide and care for their needs. The other major innovation that took place during the Middle Ages is the division between the sacred clergy and the secular clergy. The sacred clergy was made up of primarily the authority leadership, the bishops, and everybody above a bishop, so the cardinals and the pope as well. And then the other aspect of the sacred clergy were the monks or the nuns. All of these individuals were separated out from the world and lived a life that was divided from secularism. The bishops and the cardinals and the popes, they made vows of celibacy and sacred vows that separated them and made them more holy than the parish monks. Now, the secular clergy, which secular just means of the world, the secular clergy, these were the parish priests. These are the people that reached the lay people. They were the ones who provided the sacraments for townspeople and for the farmers and for the serfs that lived for the medieval lords. They were the ones that were connected with the people and with the world in some sort of function or way. The separation between the secular clergy and the sacred clergy becomes more and more important because what's fascinating is the secular clergy oftentimes were much more pious than either the bishops or the monks. Throughout the medieval period, the monks and the monastery orders became more and more corrupted by the power and the authority of the other sacred clergy, the bishops. And the bishops and the cardinals and the pope and the councils became more fraught with moral issues, which we'll talk about that later on in this lecture series on the Middle Ages as we talk about the things that lead up to the Reformation. The other major development that took place during the medieval period was scholasticism. Scholasticism was a kind of education system in which you had an expert who would come and lecture, but the lecture would be in the form of a dialectic, where the scholastic professor would provide a question and there would be a series of objections to perhaps that question and its proposition, and there would be a defense that is put together against those objections with ultimately an answer that refutes any objections that were made towards that question. This was the primary learning methodology that was used in the first universities, which the earliest universities in their founding are as follows. Bologna, which comes from the Austro-Prussian region. Bologna comes from Italy. Was founded in 1088. The University of Paris was founded in 1150, and the University of Oxford was founded in 1167. So all of this is at the turn of the millennium when scholasticism and the university emerges. When scholasticism and the university first emerge, it's primarily a educational zone to teach and prepare bishops and other academic thinkers who are going to be advisors to the kings and are going to have places of sacred authority over God's word and the church tradition. The fourth other major development took place during the Middle Ages is the existence of confraternities. If you happen to be a Roman Catholic, you are somewhat familiar with confraternities because you were part of a confraternity growing up. CCD is the primary Sunday school education component for children as they prepare for catechism and confirmation. And CCD stands for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine. It was a gathering of lay people to learn Christian doctrine together. Primarily, confraternities were gatherings of lay people who were devoting themselves in pious ways and charity around some sort of guild or grouping. Sometimes these lay people associations would take their expression like the Knights of Columbus, which if you're Roman Catholic, you might be familiar with that confraternity that still exists today. Other Guilds might surround vocation, and so there might be a confraternity of mason workers, which in the Enlightenment period and the skepticism towards enchantment and supernaturalism and Roman Catholicism, you have the development of the Freemasons who break free from the confraternity of Roman Catholic Masons and become Enlightenment vocational guild people. So these confraternities were extremely important for the lay people to develop their own piety and spirituality. And it's pretty well known that during the 14th and 15th and the 16th century, there's this strong spiritual pious resurgence among the lay people. And this resurgence comes as a surprise to most people because they think that the Reformation came because everybody was spiritually dead. But there was actually this growth in devotion during this time period among the lay people in Roman Catholicism, primarily around this confraternity. In fact, the rosary, I don't know if you're familiar with these beads that Catholics use for their prayer and devotion. The concept of the rosary actually comes out of the 15th century and the developments of the confraternities as well. The rosary was a use of pious lay devotion to the Lord and for personal worship and reflection. When we talk about the Middle Ages, the most important date that you want to think about is Christmas Day, 800 AD. That's definitely going to appear on your Unit 2 exam. This is when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor of the West. And this is significant because the Pope is showing some sort of power and authority because he is putting a crown upon an emperor, which is indicating that he has actually more power and authority than the emperor himself. I mean, who has greater power than the person who crowns or makes someone an emperor? And so this signified the ultimate authority that the Pope had both in the empire, in a sacred and a secular fashion during this time period. All right, let's continue to talk about important aspects of the Middle Ages. When we talk about the Middle Ages, feudalism is important. You have to have an understanding of the manorialism that existed during this time. The fact that there was a manor that was led by a lord, and that lord might have vassals or knights that also had property that they oversaw. And the manorial system was built on a fief. Every manor had a stretch of property that was called the fiefdom. And that property made up all that the vassal owned. And the people that worked that property, the serfs, lived on a sustenance living. They got to live on the property. They got to cultivate the land. They got to gather the fruits from the land, but they had to return all of that except what they needed to eat to the Lord. And they were taxed pretty much all of their living in order to pay for being able to live on the property and to be protected by the vassals that protected the land, the fiefdom. The other important aspect of the feudal system were the clergy who administered the sacraments to the serfs and the vassals and to the lord over the land, whether that was a prince, a baron, a duke, or perhaps somebody who stylized themselves as a king. Also important to know about the Middle Ages is the chivalric romance literature. It's literature that really gives us an understanding of what nobility was like, how to understand how the tourney system or the quest system worked. Knights during this time period were more or less like mobsters that worked for a mob boss, and they enforced the justice upon the land, and sometimes they were rather ruthless and mean. The purpose of the chivalric liturgy or literature was to create a virtue system for the knights, to call them to a higher expectation that was Christianly in its nature. And so books like Le Morte d'Arthur, The San Grail, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristram and Isolde usually had a very pious spiritual background to them. This ends the first lecture.